I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome back to the show Delegate Kathy Tran, who was elected in 2017 and is completing a second term, 4 years in the General Assembly. I think it has been about 3 years or more since we had a chance to have you on the show. And I remember some of the conversation then. We were talking about some innovations that you were getting made in the Pocahontas building to make it more friendly to young mothers who would be there, and that was certainly something that was very much needed. You represent part of Fairfax County. Uh, you have been serving now for these 4 years, and before I say more, Angel wants to ask you some questions about what really got you started in this, and then we'll come to the issue of the time right now. So, Angel.
Thank you. What sparked your interest into joining the General Assembly?
No, I appreciate it. And good morning, David and Angel. I'm so glad to join
Good
you.
morning.
I've never thought of myself as somebody who would run for office. And still now, when somebody says, and I knock on their doors, they're like, I've never had a politician come to my house to talk to me before. I'm always like, what? Where's the politician? Because I'm just a mom, right? But in 2016, during that presidential election, I was pregnant with my fourth child. And we realized, my husband and I, that the outcomes of that election and the election of Donald Trump was going to lead this country down a path that was really kind of the antithesis of the values that our family had. My parents had come with me to this country when I was almost 2 years old as boat refugees from Vietnam. And my husband has family that, escaped anti-Semitism at the turn of the century. So when we were thinking about names for our child, she was born a couple of days after Inauguration Day in 2017, and we gave her the name Elise Munken. And Elise was inspired by Ellis Island. So Matt's family had passed through Ellis Island in their search for opportunity. And Munken is Vietnamese for bright bell, which is, was inspired by the Liberty Bell. So to us, her name means to ring the bells of liberty and champion opportunity for all. And I made the decision to run when she was about a month old because I realized I couldn't sit on the sidelines. I had 4 kids and I really needed to roll my sleeves up and help shape their futures and really advance the values of hope and opportunity and freedom that my parents had risked our lives for coming to this country. And so that's why I ran for office for the first time in 2017.
This past session, you helped introduce a bill about SNAP benefits. Could you expand a little bit about that and how college students could possibly qualify?
Yeah, so that bill was introduced by Delegate Dan Helmer, and it's just really made the kind of some of the criteria a little bit less restrictive in terms of who would be eligible. I mean, I believe it says that if you're a part of an employment or education program, training program, right, and that could count as towards the work requirements and such. And so it's just really expanded eligibility and makes sure that some of our most vulnerable Virginians can now apply for SNAP, which provides nutritional and food benefits. So I think it's really exciting because particularly what we're seeing in COVID is that there's so many people who are really struggling, right? Whether it's they're worried about making rent or paying their mortgage on time, making their car payments, literally putting food on the table, trying to access unemployment insurance benefits. I think when we're able to be generous and kind-hearted, it goes a long way. And so I think this is going to be a huge opportunity for some of our most vulnerable Virginian families.
As you kind of mentioned earlier, since the whole Trump era, Stop Asian Hate has been trending on social media. What are your thoughts on spreading awareness?
I think it's incredibly important. One of the most wide-ranging and deep, wide and deep legacies of Trump, I think, is sowing these seeds of division in our country. And one of them is this extremely disturbing and steep rise in violence and hate towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in America. And we really need to make sure that we talk about what that is, what that looks like, and how do we be what we call in my family an upstander and not just a bystander. You might hear my other baby, since I was elected, baby Warren is, I think, heading my way. So he'll join us in a little bit, but, and I think that's really important. And that's what, Stop API Hate or Stop Asian Hate has been, kind of discussed in this whole year of the pandemic, as we've seen a rise, and people in the community have been trying really hard to call attention to it. But I think the murders in Georgia that took place almost 2 weeks ago has really just put a fine point on why we really need to talk about what's going on and how do we address it.
Why do you think media outlets don't share what the Asian community is going through? Because I know I wasn't aware until maybe a year ago.
I think that that is such a poignant question, right? And I think sometimes when we talk about hope and we talk about opportunity, we say that there's only a finite amount, right? Only so many people can have jobs. Only so many people can achieve the American dream. So that really pits us against each other. Then on the flip side, when we talk about some of the racism, the bigotry, the hate, the violence that so many communities face on a daily basis, it also seems to be like the media seems to portray it as there's only so much airtime we can give, right, to that conversation. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I think when we even look at what happened in Georgia, how the media is framing it as, is this a racist act? Is this an act of sexism and misogyny, right? Is this an act of workplace violence? Is this a result of, lax gun laws? And when you frame it as an either or rather than all of the above, right? Because I really think it's all of the above, right? Then you aren't able to get to the core of what's happening in it, right? Like all of these things are intersecting. And so I think that is an example of just how deep-seated some of these issues are for the AAPI community. But I think also so many people don't recognize Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as a minority, right? The model minority myth that we are, high achieving community that doesn't have any issues to talk about really glosses over any of the disparities that we face internally and amongst the diverse communities that comprise the AAPI community broadly. Things like that. And so I think that myth and that stereotype is really feeding into how the media portrays us.
The challenge going forward is one that you and your colleagues here in the General Assembly are addressing, of establishing a new caucus. And I think hopefully our viewers have heard about that caucus. They've perhaps read something about it. But please tell us all about it, and tell us about the openness that there is for others to join that caucus.
Yes, absolutely. So we announced on Friday that we are founding, I'm not sure if that's how you use that verb, but we are going to start a caucus, Virginia Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus in the General Assembly. And so the founding members are myself, Delegate Mark Keem out of Fairfax, Delegate Kelly Converse Fowler out of Virginia Beach, Delegate Suhas Subramanian from Loudoun, and Senator Ghazala Hashmi from the Chesterfield Henrico area. So we are the 5 members in the General Assembly that identify as AAPI, and there might be others as well who do, but we're going to be really focused on kind of harnessing our voices and lifting up some of the concerns specific to our community, as well as working in coalition and allyship with others on, some of our common goals, right? But we recognize that there are lots of General Assembly members who, for different reasons, whether they be personal in their own lives or because their district has a large AAPI population, might also want to join the caucus. And we've heard from them already, both delegates and senators who want to be a part of the caucus. And so we are going to welcome those who want to join us and move forward together to lift up the voices of the AAPI community and our priorities and work together. And so we are going to have 3 regional listening sessions in April. We're still working out the dates, but they're all going to be virtual. So it's virtually regional sessions, but one in Northern Virginia, one in kind of Central Virginia in the Richmond and Henrico area, one in kind of the Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach, Tidewater area. And we'll engage local community members and leaders in conversations about what they're hearing, what their concerns are. And I imagine those will be very wide-ranging conversations and topics. We'll take all of that input, and then in May, to coincide with AAPI Heritage Month, we'll kind of unveil a policy platform to help us, the beginnings of a platform that will fine-tune leading into the 2022 legislative session. But all of our General Assembly members, we're going to have a meeting, I think in April, where we invite folks to come and participate and be a part of this movement. But I think, David, it's really important to note that we're not a caucus that's going to stand alone. We're going to, we recognize that so much of our work crosses communities and have a lot of support from other members as well. And so we know that we'll be working in concert with the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus, with the Virginia Latino Caucus, both of whom members and the caucuses themselves have stepped out to stand in support of stopping AAPI hate, and we really appreciate that. But I know that we have a lot of really common goals that we're going to be working towards.
Well, it sounds very exciting, particularly to have those listening sessions. And please let us know when they're happening, and we'll try to help get the word out too.
Absolutely.
Encourage people to be a part of it. One of my friends who's a professor at Wake Forest, I know I didn't mention that you're a Duke graduate, and also University of Michigan. We didn't give you all the credentials, but Dr. Mary Foskett has written a blog recently entitled "Invisibility is no longer an option." And one of the things that really jumped out at me that I want to read to you and get your reaction to it. She says, to spell out anti-Asian racism is not to minimize or diminish hundreds of years of anti-Black racism, and so forth. And then in the next paragraph, she says, she speaks of the big lie of white supremacy and privilege, which says that only one history of racism can matter at a time, if any matter at all. And she is Asian American and writes about her own experience. And I'll tell you some of my reactions, and I'd be interested in yours too. That I think it really struck a note with me that we tend, I can't speak for everyone, but to address one racism at a time. And instead of realizing that there are many people in this country who experience racism, and it's not just of one particular race. And it caused me to reflect on some of the movies that I grew up with as a child that had the Chinese laborers working on the railroad. But that was, and they were good workers, that was all portrayed, but it really minimized who they were as someone who could build a railroad across the country. And when I think of all the ways that we as a country, through different acts of Congress and through interments in the Second World War, where we have openly and blatantly been racist toward Asian Americans, and even recently, with talking about the China virus. The China virus, I mean, that to me that's racist. Well, I rattled on much longer than I intended, but I really would like for you to share from what your perspectives are.
You know, and I think there's so much to unpack, but in your comments, David, I think gets back to the original questions that Angel had asked me, right? Like, why don't we talk about it more? And I think it's one way that I think institutionally and culturally we're able to continue to you know, continue to have like institutional racism, I guess, is because there's this myth that there's only so much hope and opportunity, and only so many people can achieve the American dream, because if somebody achieves it, that means you don't get it, right? And so that helps to kind of to perpetuate some of the situations that we continue to face. But the other piece of it is also, well, only one community faces, right? We only have enough airtime to talk about what one community faces, and we're still unpacking that. And then everybody else, you know, we don't have that. And although all the situations that we're facing are really linked, right? When we're talking about redlining, that was happening against APIs as it was happening against Black Americans, right? When we, you know, but I think it's another way for us to institutionally still try to pit people against each other, because then it becomes well, this is how bad I have had it. No, this is how bad I've had it, right? And like, it's almost as if there's only so much badness to go around. Like, trust me, there's a lot of badness to go around too, right? And so I think that's how you keep, it keeps us from building the coalitions and working together. But the truth is, you know, across communities, whether it's APIs, Latinx community, you know, the Indigenous community or the Black community, people have been working in allyship over history, right? And trying to lift each other up and support each other. And I firmly believe that we only rise when we all rise together. And that's why, you know, I'm really focused on the fact that this caucus we're forming stands on the shoulders of community leaders and organizations that have served and are continuing to serve APIs in Virginia, and that it will be successful in its ability, only in its ability to coalition build and work with people, whether they are members of other caucuses or just other members in the General Assembly. And I think that's going to be really important as we move forward. But in the history piece you talk about, there's just so much history we don't know. And I think the fact that the post you mentioned was invisible, and we're not going to be invisible no longer, right? We have been invisible in US history. We've like literally been erased from US history. And I don't know if you had a chance to see the PBS documentary about Asian Americans this summer, but I watched with my kids. We watched most of it. Some of it was tough for them. But I remember when they talked about the Chinese railroad workers, people who literally lost limbs in building the railroad, right, from the West Coast through to meet in the middle. I think there was like a picture at the end, and they weren't included in the picture in terms of who built the railroad. And it was really startling. And I remember my kids and I were just like, I remember, you know, reading about it in grad school, but my kids, like their eyes just popped open. What do you mean? People like literally did this work. They were dying for this work, barely getting paid, right? And they weren't even included in the final, you know, image of who built the railroad. And I think that is so symbolic of where APIs fall in American history, and why it's so important for us just to learn the history, so that we know that even though we've faced racism and violence throughout, right, API history, we've also persisted. We've worked in concert in building those coalitions with others and lifted others up. And I think that's just really important for us to know, so we don't repeat history, but we also know kind of the strength that we've had throughout as well.
You've mentioned something that I've failed to do, and I will be looking for that PBS documentary. Undergraduate major in history and a master's degree at NYU a generation ago in American studies. And as I've thought about the courses that I took in that graduate program, there was not a single one
Yeah.
that I could recall that had more than a chapter, more than perhaps a part of one class that really dealt with Asian Americans. I mean, the history of blacks in the South, histories of blacks in the city. I mean, the NYU is really, hopefully I'm going to check out that program now.
You should.
And see what they're providing now.
It's freely streaming is how my husband tells me I have to describe it. So you have to stream it, but it's free. They made it available right after the shooting in Georgia.
Before we would end, and we thank you for your time. And I was hoping that smallest one maybe was going to come over closer, but the sound must have disappeared and gone the other direction.
I think my husband took him outside for some fresh air.
I guess they've been on so many Zooms with you that they don't want to.
Yeah, yes. So baby Warren, I think my husband took him out front for some fresh air. It's nice and cool spring day up here. Right. But, I really appreciate you both bringing attention to this issue. And I just think, it's really, really sad that it took the targeted killing of, these of 8 people, 6 Asian American women, for us to have this national conversation. My hope is, we're going to do our piece in Virginia to keep the steady drumbeat about these issues. I just want to highlight a couple of them before we end. Making sure we have equitable access to state government services, including language access. And I actually got started on this past session. Dr. Underwood's, our Chief Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Officer. I might have gotten those in the wrong order, but she and her team are going to be looking at making recommendations for a language access policy for the state. And what we've seen, right, is for example, it's really hard if you're not a Spanish speaker to get unemployment insurance benefits information, right? They are working on that, but some of the VDH, the Virginia Department of Health information about COVID and the vaccines were mistranslated into Spanish. And I think there was one for a period of time where it was the Spanish translation was getting a vaccine is not important, because I think it was like might have been a Google Translate issue type of thing. But, we see that across state government. We want to make sure that we have a consistent policy and understand, when we should provide interpretation services and translation services so that people who need to access those services can do so. So that's one thing. The second is really around hate crimes and the reporting of hate crimes, the looking and investigation of hate crimes that are reported by APIs and others. So that's going to be a big issue. Data disaggregation, right? When we talked about the model minority myth earlier, hiding the disparities within the community, this is looking at, things might be very different for communities that have come here more recently than those that have been here for generations, all within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. So really disaggregating that data so that we can target where services are going to be needed. And then making sure that we are, addressing any discrimination and lifting up APIs into leadership positions and providing that training and that, ability, building that bench, so to speak. So those are just some of the ideas that we've had that I think are going to come up, but we really look forward to the conversations and the listening sessions that I mentioned to you earlier.
Well, we thank you very much. And my friends in North Carolina and friends in Kentucky and Tennessee are looking to Virginia to lead the way.
Absolutely.
And certainly you and others are doing that already. And we thank you so much, Delegate Tran, for being on This Week in Virginia. And we look forward to those listening sessions coming up. But thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Angel.
Thank you.
Take care.
Angel, what did you think of the show we just had?
I really liked the show. I think it was nice to talk, to actually sit down and have a conversation about Asian hate. Not a lot of people talk about it, and I know a lot of people don't know about it. So I think it was really nice to bring this to our viewers.
I was thinking at some time during the show that it was that hopefully we're somewhat representative of the Commonwealth, because there were three of us on the show and we have three different racial backgrounds.
Mhm.
And I think that it will not be long before this country is, as they express it, majority minority.
Yeah.
And I think that it really going to be interesting to.
I think it's interesting because there's minority schools. How both of you touched on how there's no Chinese history has been erased. There's not institutions for Asians. There's institutions for Black people and for Hispanic serving people, but I don't see institutions that specifically just for like Asian Americans to go to. So I think that was interesting.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm going to have to check out NYU
Mhm.
and see what that American Studies program offers now. Well, we look forward to some additional shows coming up. We want our viewers to know that we are always open to hearing suggestions about topics, about guests. We can be contacted by email at twiva@capitalsquare.com. That's like This Week in Virginia, twiva@capitalsquare.com, and can give us suggestions. And we will certainly consider those and be glad to see if we can include suggestions that we receive.
Mhm.
So thank you, Angel Miner, for being the co-host of the show. And we will be seeing our viewers with another show next week.
Yes.